Hello, my name is Tosca Bruno van Vijveken and I'm at the Transnational NGO Initiative here at the Maxwell School. Today we have with us Professor Dave Karpf. He's assistant professor at the School for Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. And he is with us today because we are embarking on some initial research on digital transnational NGOs and their role in global governance, and Professor Dave Karpf has a lot to teach us in that regard. So thank you for agreeing to visit and to talk with me also as part of your visit today. So tell me, Professor Karpf, what is the nature of your research exactly?
I primarily study NGOs or nonprofits within the United States. I study political activism mostly outside of elections and the ways that the internet has changed the structure of political organizing.
Okay. So how do you feel, so you did say that your research agenda is primarily domestic.
Primarily, yes.
Primarily, but not entirely. So tell me how I understand you're working on a second book that will eventually result in a third book and so on. How does your research agenda relate to transnational NGOs and their digital activism?
Well, so primarily, my first book was called The Moveon Effect, and it was about Moveon.org and the new generation of advocacy groups in the United States, and how this generation, what I call netroots organizations, differs from legacy or more traditional organizations in the United States. After that book was written, I started to meet activists who have taken that MoveOn model and exported it abroad. So in particular, there's a network of organizations called OPEN, Online Progressive Engagement Network, founded by a guy named Ben Branzel, who's a former MoveOn staffer, also one of the co-founders of Oz.org, which is an international MoveOn-style organization. And he's now gone around the world connecting with and helping to launch MoveOn-style groups in the United Kingdom, in Germany, in Australia, in Canada. He's helping to launch similar organizations in several other countries, including India right now. So I've started to study that international network of organizations. And the big question is what happens to this model when you put it in a different country's context. And along with that, studying NGOs, many of the NGOs that I study are based in the United States and focused on the United States. But since many of these problems are international problems, a number of them are connected to organizations with more international focus. So I'm also looking at how this sort of model and the challenges and opportunities of the internet translate over to international organizations and international issues.
So I have two follow-up questions. I noticed when you were doing your talk today, your public talk, we're talking about this open network that you mentioned a range of countries where a MoveOn.org model is being kind of rolled out, if you will. Now, you mentioned India, you just mentioned that also, but I didn't see a lot of other non-Western countries there. Why do you think that is? Is that still a phenomenon, kind of a first generation? Do you expect it to roll out to what we call sometimes global South countries or global East countries?
That is something that they are currently trying. And so the question, I think, 3 to 4 years from now, they will have a track record that we can evaluate. Right now, it's efforts that are ongoing. The challenge is that it's relatively easy, at least conceptually, to port the MoveOn model over to, say, Australia. They speak the same language, which means in a practical manner, people, Branzel didn't help to launch GetUp in Australia, other people launched it, and then he's helped since it started. But in Australia, when they launched GetUp, they could sign up for MoveOn's emails and read those emails and try that same style in their own country. It was more of a challenge for Compact in Germany, which is the one non-English speaking member of this network, because Germany had to read English emails and then try out that style in German. So when you're porting over to different languages, and also when you're moving to countries that don't rely on the same internet tools that the US relies on, people in the United States are all on email and they spend a lot of time on the web and on their smartphones. Those are the habits that the MoveOn style model is adapted to originally. When we move to the global south, or what I've now heard called the global majority, when you move to those other countries where people are online but using different tools and in different ways, you actually need to develop new technologies in order to help them engage in the same sorts of organizations. So what I've been seeing in my field observations is right now the technologists are having the conversations about what should we build and how do we think it will work. and they're in the process of trying things out.
I see. And now the example of India, tell us a little bit more about that, because you talked during your talk about how that is not based on smartphone and internet models, but more on text messaging, right, through simple phones, if you will. Yeah,
the majority of citizens in India, my understanding, are connected, but they're connected via SMS text messaging. Yeah. One of the practices they often have in India is missed calls. So people will call each other, and rather than picking up the call, which you'll then get charged for, they'll leave a missed call, and that can signal to somebody that you're there or you're coming. Yeah. So that's a way that they signal to each other through their non-smartphones and communicate. Right. One of the techniques that was recently tried in India was using that missed call function in order to sign petitions. So there was a government minister of some sort who was engaged in a scandal, and they wanted to demonstrate that there was broad disapproval of this scandal. Yeah. And so they put up billboards saying, leave a missed call message at this number, and we'll treat that as a petition signature. And I believe it was like tens of millions of people signed through that manner. That's a new technology. That's something that hasn't been created. Right. If you tried to use that in the United States, it wouldn't work very well because we don't have a habit of missed call phenomenon. So they need to develop these new techniques and technologies and then figure out how do you turn that into a lasting civil society organization. So it's a new set of challenges that they're now working through. Yeah, interesting. So now you work at the School for Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. Tell us a little bit how your work fits into the mission of that school. At the School of Media and Public Affairs, one of the main things that we do is train political professionals. So many of my master's students are people who either have been press secretaries or would like to be press secretaries. They're people who engage in these political advocacy campaigns or work around elections. So I teach a course on strategic political communication where I teach them both traditional organizing skills, how do you plan and run big political campaigns or advocacy campaigns, and then we also talk about how the new technologies affect the types of campaigns that you would run today. So in many ways, I think, particularly for a graduate program, the research that I do is pretty central to what our students come there to learn. It is indeed. Now, you yourself have a background in face-to-face, non-digital activism. Tell us about how that started and how it influenced your academic route. Sure. So the Sierra Club is the oldest and largest environmental organization in America. It was founded in 1892. They have a federated structure. They have statewide chapters. They have local groups made up of volunteer leaders. And they also have a student-run arm called the Sierra Student Coalition. When I was 16 years old, I joined the Sierra Club and started attending local group meetings. By age 18, I had joined the Sierra Student Coalition and was sitting on long conference calls with my fellow student environmental activists. And I had, about 15 years probably, where I was playing various volunteer roles in the Sierra Club, including 6 years on the National Board of Directors. That's where I learned politics and advocacy. That's where I was trained in traditional community organizing and environmental organizing practices. And actually, back in 1999, I served as National Director of Sierra Student Coalition, and at one point met the person who was at the time the head of Moveon.org back when it was getting started. And when he walked away, I turned to a colleague of mine and we kind of laughed and said, yeah, that'll never go anywhere. Incidentally, I'm also terrible at picking stocks, just terrible. But the reason was that back when I was involved in activism, even though most of us had email, we hadn't figured out how to use these digital technologies for most of the things that we wanted to achieve. We had moved our offline petitions to online petitions, but it was still just a tactic. And since then, and as I became an academic, I started to notice the ways that we had moved from these tactics to larger organizational changes, bigger changes in how we define members, how we raise money, and how we engage people in politics. So that really got me very interested in the ways that these things were changing and how it affected older legacy organizations, and it became the core of my research agenda. Yeah, nice. So if you look at the kinds of digital organizations that you're most interested in, what kind of core challenges do they need to address? Here in the TNGO initiative for the last 10 years, we focus really mostly on brick and mortar. We now
want to get a bigger understanding of digital actors. What are the digital actors, the Moveon.orgs, the Avazes, the Change.orgs of this world? What are the biggest challenges right now? Because on the one hand, it could be, one could say, oh, this is like the new generation, this new frontier. But they too, I imagine, have their own strengths as well as challenges.
The biggest challenges that they face are new iterations on the challenges that NGOs have always faced. So there's the day-to-day challenge of how are we going to pay the bills and produce the work that we produce. That challenge is still there for the new groups, just as it was there for the old groups. And then there's the broader question of how do we build power to achieve our mission. That's a question that NGOs have always asked as long as they've been around. It's a question that still confronts the new ones, with the added element that these new organizations that have developed new engagement techniques also need to push at the boundaries of how can we make those techniques more effective. So the most obvious element of this is these newer organizations are engaging people in what we could probably call thinner manners. The oldest organizations were engaging people in participatory engagement, having them turn out to meetings, having them really become deeply involved. The average person who's engaged in a digital NGO is usually receiving their emails, occasionally reading it, occasionally deleting it, and occasionally doing a little more. So the challenge for these digital NGOs is how can we deepen that member engagement? How can we move from mobilizing to organizing and really build citizen power that can help us to achieve our political goals? That's the same question that older NGOs have always asked.
It is.
So they're facing the same sets of questions. They're using techniques, so they have to apply those questions to the new techniques to decide if they're being effective and how they can be more effective.
Yeah, interesting. So is there a particular area that you think is in your realm of research that is under-investigated and that you wish others than yourself, because you have lots of plans for the second and third book, etc., but that are under-investigated that you would like others to take up?
Yeah, I think most centrally, very few scholars who are interested in online politics are looking at what I would term the organizational layer of politics. We tend to either study political elites, like elected officials, or we study the mass public. And you usually study the mass public by doing big surveys. You usually study elites by observing elites and gathering data on what they do. I've seen probably 24 studies of what members of Congress tweet. And those things are worth studying, but this intermediary layer of organizations, of civil society groups, that's how we translate citizen power into opinion that can matter for elites. And very few people are studying those organizations. I think one of the reasons is that our most robust social science tools tend to be the survey, they tend to be content analysis, and the cutting edge tools tend to be various forms of analysis of big data, so computational analysis. If you want to study organizations, then you really have to go back to old school techniques of interviews, of ethnography, of actually observing these people as they use the tools. I think that's important to do, not only because the organizations themselves are important, but because you'll pick up on an awful lot of important activities that don't leave a digital footprint. It's a lot easier to study hashtags, which leave a publicly accessible digital footprint, than to study back-channel email groups, where people are deciding what should the context of our campaign be, when should we launch it, who's going to do what. Those back channels aren't public, so we can't do computational analysis of it. And so I worry that scholars are moving towards studying the things that are most accessible rather than the things that are most important. I would love to see more scholars doing the old school work of studying organizations by actually interacting with them.
Well, maybe that is a good end to the interview, because that's actually one thing that we hope to do within this space.
That's why I'm excited about your study.
Well, that's wonderful to hear. As you know, it's still at its very beginnings. But thanks so much for coming to Syracuse today to educate us on this important topic.
Thank you for